now we have Paul Matter switching over from the ocean to hydrogen, or I guess, H2O to just H. We have Paul Matter, who is the co-founder and CTO of Power to Hydrogen. The company is focused on the commercialization of systems for hydrogen generation and energy storage. Paul, I'm not going to give away the little fact that Peter was regaling us with about you and exploration. So I'll let you just take it from there, and look forward to hearing more about your company.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Rob, and thanks, Peter, for having me. Really want to talk about three things today. The first is misconceptions regarding the challenges with green hydrogen. The second thing is what we see as the real challenges with implementing green hydrogen. And then finally, what Power to Hydrogen, the company, is doing to address the real challenges. We all know about the potential of green hydrogen, but there's a lot of misinformation out there about the efficiency and the physics problem that green hydrogen has. And that's the main misconception that we see a lot. And that misconception is really based on an analysis that was done a long time ago that compared, if you take a electric vehicle powered by a battery and plug it in to a renewable energy grid versus an electrolyzer that makes hydrogen plugged into a renewable energy grid, that the battery electric approach would be 2 or 3 times more efficient. The problem is that premise is not an apples to apples comparison. If you want to get to an electrical grid that's 100% powered by renewable energy, you need a lot of long duration energy storage. And so to store that energy in the form of batteries or electrons, you would need just as much batteries off of a vehicle as you would on the vehicle. And right now, it's not efficient to store electrons for a long period of time. Really, the best way to do it is probably with hydroelectric power, and that's about 70% efficient, but it's very dependent on geographical location. To store electricity in a lithium-ion battery, for long term, it's only on about 60% efficient on average. And lower cost methods for storing long duration energy is even less efficient than that. So if you take into account the long duration energy storage, then having 100% renewable energy grid that's only relying on batteries is not a very good approach. Now, with the hydrogen approach, that long duration energy storage is already built in. If you take electricity from a windmill or a solar panel, you electrolyze water to make hydrogen, you can just store that hydrogen in a tank as long as you want. So if you take that into account, and you also take into account realistic efficiencies for new forms of electrolysis, for ways of distributing hydrogen, and the efficiency of fuel cell electric vehicles that are being produced nowadays, we found that the wind to wheel or solar to wheel efficiency of hydrogen and electric vehicles are nearly identical if you take into account that long duration storage that you need for 100% renewable grid. And so if you don't believe me, we've crunched the numbers on it. I've published it on my LinkedIn page. So feel free to look that up and try to pick it apart, and I can reply to any criticisms you have. But
Peter told me there would be no math today. So
okay, there's no math. I'm not going to do the numbers. I'm going to let people dig into that if they want to. But my second point is that efficiency is not really that important either. So what's really important is the levelized cost of energy storage. And efficiency is a factor in that. But as the cost of renewable energy comes down and down, the efficiency of storing it isn't as important as the equipment you need, the capital equipment you need to purchase to store that energy. And so this is where the comparison gets a little bit interesting between batteries and fuel cells. For batteries, it's very low cost to store energy for short durations. So if you need to store a kilowatt hour of energy with a battery, it only takes a 1 kilowatt hour battery. But if you need to store 10 kilowatt hours, you need 10 of those batteries. In the case of fuel cells, it's very expensive for short duration storage because you need to buy equipment to make the hydrogen, and then you need to buy equipment to compress the hydrogen, and then equipment to convert it back into electricity. But storing that hydrogen is very low cost. So a 1 kilowatt-hour fuel cell system is much more expensive than a 1 kilowatt-hour battery. But if you need 10 hours of energy storage, all you have to do is add additional tanks of hydrogen. And a tank of hydrogen is about 10 times less expensive than a battery. And if you can store that hydrogen in the ground, in say like a salt cavern, then it's 100 or 200 times less expensive than a battery. So it really comes down to what the application is and how long you need to store that energy to determine what's the most economic in terms of the levelized cost of energy storage. So applications that require short duration storage would be like solar shifting. Maybe you take solar during the peak hours of the day, shift it a couple hours to track when the air conditioners kick on. That makes sense to use batteries. If you're talking about vehicles, light duty vehicles, where you maybe only drive your car 1 or 2 hours a day for a commute, like I do with my electric vehicle, it makes sense to have a battery. But for long duration storage, so say you're shifting between seasons because you're in the northern part of the United States and you don't get as much sun during the winter, or you're relying on wind power and you need days of energy storage, that's where fuel cells become a much better option than anything else that's out there right now. In the case of vehicles, heavy duty vehicles are used much more than 1 or 2 hours a day. So things like heavy duty trucks, buses, trains, planes. In the case of ships, you may need to operate for weeks without recharging. That's where it makes sense to use fuel cells and it's more economical. So it really comes down to the application, what the lower cost, levelized cost of energy storage will be. Beyond that, there are some applications I should mention as well that really can't use batteries, and that's things like metal refining, making fertilizer, and also producing chemicals. Those are all applications where you have to use hydrogen to do the processing. And so if you take into account those heavy duty applications and those applications where you have to use hydrogen, it's a significant part of CO2 emissions right now. It's about 40% of the CO2 emissions come from those types of applications. So that's why hydrogen is very important. Now, as I mentioned, the challenge is with the high priced cost of equipment. And so that's what we're really working on here at Power to Hydrogen. We're developing systems that are low cost and they aren't relying on precious metals, but they can also produce hydrogen at high pressure, and it gets rid of the need for the expensive compressor. And we can produce hydrogen at storage pressure and use that to either store energy and run it backwards through our system to produce electricity, or supply it to a fueling station where there's a final stage of compression to load it into a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle. A second thing that we're doing is making these systems containerized and transportable so you can put them at the point where you want to use the hydrogen. And that's going to cut back on the distribution costs with hydrogen and the inefficiencies with distributing hydrogen by truck. So really all you're transferring is electrons to the point where you want to use the hydrogen, and on site you convert it into hydrogen that you can either use for your vehicle or store it, as I said, and run it back through the system. A third thing that's important to note though is that dual functionality of operating as both an electrolyzer and as a power generating unit allow our systems to have more uptime. So a traditional electrolyzer, you only use it when you have excess electricity coming off a wind turbine. With our system, when you have that excess electricity, you make the hydrogen. But if you have periods where you need backup power for resiliency, or you need power for peak shaving, we can run the hydrogen back through our system and generate electricity. And that increase in utilization really cuts back on the capital costs because you have a single piece of equipment that's doing multiple functions. It's doing compression, it's doing the hydrogen generation, it's also doing electricity generation for when electricity is needed. So ultimately, we see hydrogen obviously having a number of uses that are going to be dependent on the duty cycle. It's going to be dependent on where you're located, what's the weather patterns, how far north are you, and it will be dependent on future technology developments. And we think lowering that cost of the capital equipment is what's really going to help speed the adoption, accelerate the adoption of green hydrogen. And that's what we're focused on. And the last point I wanted to make is that I do think batteries have helped spur the interest in hydrogen. People are seeing the batteries take off, and how the technology has really developed over the last decade and exciting. And it's starting to make zero emission vehicles possible. And I think that's helping spur investment in fuel cells because people understand the fuel cells will be the next big thing. But I also think fuel cells are going to help batteries actually become zero emission, because in order to get to 100% renewable energy grid, you need to have fuel cells to provide that resiliency and backup power that's needed for long duration energy storage. So I think both technologies complement each other and they need each other. So happy to answer any questions.
So you're not waging a war on batteries is
No,
the final takeaway there.
I did, yeah. I want to make that clear. And I do drive a battery electric vehicle, and I love it. I'm not going back to internal combustion engines. So I hope my next car can be a fuel cell vehicle.
There you go. So actually, that brings up, one of the use cases you said where there's maybe competing, and it could depend on use case or fleet vehicles or whatever. You mentioned heavy duty, marine. That's also areas where, in addition to batteries, which have come up in electrification in general, there's also compressed natural gas or some other, other ways to shift the heavy duty vehicles. In your vast number crunching, have you seen how that plays out, or it kind of depends on whether it's long haul, short haul, amount of space? I mean, when I hear compressed natural gas, I often think of, space requirements. Hydrogen, same thing, versus batteries as batteries start to shrink. So that, maybe that's one of the things you could speak to more.
Yeah, so compressed natural gas, it's obviously much cleaner than diesel fuel, but it doesn't get you all the way to zero emissions. Unless maybe it's biogas, but that's going to be much more expensive than regular natural gas. And so from that perspective, we don't, there's a lot of mandates from companies that have these big fleets. They want to be zero emission by 2030, for instance. And if you start adopting and changing your infrastructure over to compressed natural gas, you're probably not going to want to do it again by 2030. So that's why we think, hydrogen, the time is right for hydrogen. With that 2030 target that a number of organizations have, they're going to start to look at implementing hydrogen now, testing it out, seeing how it works, and proving it out. And that's what we think is going to happen over this next decade. The green hydrogen is really going to be proven out as, in the first place, it's going to be proven out as in fleet vehicles, because that makes a lot of sense. You only need one filling station. Typically, fleets are heavy duty. It's for deliveries or buses that will operate around the clock. And it's what's happening already in warehouses with fleets of forklifts at, for instance, like Amazon and Walmart warehouses. They operate 24/7, and they're already using hydrogen-powered forklifts because of those same advantages that I talked about. So I think hydrogen ultimately makes more sense for companies that are committed to zero emission, especially with the time frame being 2030.
Got it. Peter brought up something about NASA, and when he did that, I just, thinking of hydrogen, I assume you've seen the movie The Martian, and when he's like, oh, because nothing bad has ever happened when you light hydrogen on fire in the history of man. So is there something related to space travel and your firm that we should know about?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So the earliest of early adopter applications that we have for our technology is for NASA, where they need long duration energy storage for microgrids that they're going to build on the moon for the moon base. And the reason they need long duration energy storage is because the nighttime on the moon lasts up to 350 hours. So it's not a 12-hour nighttime like we have on Earth. So they need technology that can provide very long duration energy storage. And that's why they're interested in reversible fuel cell systems to do that. And so we do have a contract right now where we're building a prototype system, and we're hoping it can be launched to the moon in early 2024 to demonstrate that it works there. And yeah, so that's an exciting project we're working on right now. It's not a huge market. There's probably only one or two of these systems that will be put to use, but it's pretty cool to be a part of.
Yeah, I was going to say that the coolness factor kind of outweighs the market capability on that one. So very, very interesting on that front. And I think that does play to one of the things that you highlighted on the use cases for where you're seeing the powers of where hydrogen can really be a difference maker, and the uptime. And could you speak a little bit more to that? Because honestly, when I heard you talking about it, to put it in as the guy who's been finance and operations in the clean tech sector for a long time, it's about, and you brought up levelized cost of energy, which is really another way for how efficient are your dollars, really. And it really is to me, it sounds no different than a cogen system making as efficient use as possible. And you have the ability to, like you said, I think, could you get a little bit more into the uptime and how that can really be a difference maker compared to a battery?
Yeah, it's really because, batteries, as I mentioned, for long duration energy storage, it's a linear relationship with cost. So the more energy storage you need, the cost it stays the same in dollars per kilowatt hour. But with fuel cells, as the amount of power required becomes smaller relative to the amount of energy, so that means basically the uptime is longer, what you see is the cost kind of levelizes out right at the cost of that energy storage as you get to very long durations. And energy storage with a fuel cell, it's just putting gas in a tank, or even putting gas in a cavern, like natural gas is stored today. That's how we stockpile natural gas. We fill it up in salt caverns. So you can store large amounts of energy at a very low cost. So if your application has very high uptime, then you need a big tank. You just need a bigger tank of hydrogen to store the energy. And essentially that cost in dollars per kilowatt hour starts to decrease and level out right at about the cost of that tank, which is $10 per kilowatt hour. It's an order of magnitude lower than what it would cost to store that much energy in a battery. So that's where the economics start to favor fuel cells and hydrogen, is when you have that really long uptime and the cost starts to levelize out at the cost of that energy storage.
We only have a couple minutes left, but that the storage of caverns made me think of something where, one of the things of hydrogen coming up a lot more recently is how are some of the fossil fuel firms going to be able to transition a lot of their capacity CapEx equipment. Is hydrogen storage just as simple as replacing? I remember that was a big push for the California batteries. They had the natural gas storage that popped a leak, and all of a sudden, could you basically drop in hydrogen into that same infrastructure? How much infrastructure changing is required for some of these systems?
Yeah. So, for instance, if you're talking about like putting hydrogen, the pipeline is where that's being looked at right now, and that they're starting to do that in England and Northern Europe, looking at blending in hydrogen into the natural gas pipeline, and that's perfectly doable without any issues, up to 10 or 20% at least. The question is, how high can you really go with changing over that infrastructure? And the expensive infrastructure is really the pipelines. Mm-hmm. It should be doable with existing pipelines. Now, if you're using it though for heating, the furnaces and the burners, like the furnaces that you have in your house, that's going to have to be different, or that's going to have to change. And so how do you make that transition from a furnace that operates on natural gas to, it can operate off of some hydrogen, but at some point you got to start switching out furnaces and using.
Well, and that moves to, as you said, kind of your containerized solution versus networks of pipes, for example.
Okay. Yeah, exactly.
Well, so unfortunately we are at time, and while this has been great, I do not want to cut off our next speaker at any time. So Paul, any last words and or ways to get a hold of you?
No, look, but as I mentioned, if you want to look me up on LinkedIn, you can see the numbers from my analysis. If you really want to dig into that, it's Paul Matter at Power to Hydrogen, and it was published within the last couple of months, so you should find it, or connect with me if you want to talk more about this.
All right. Thanks a lot, Paul. Really appreciate you taking the time.